I would like to invite now to speak Ms. Margareta Wahlstrom, the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. The floor is yours, Madam.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Good morning. I'm going to talk about why disaster risk reduction is so important and what parliamentarians' role is in this regard. The advantage of being the last speaker is that I can claim how it all hangs together, because you will find some similarities among what we are saying in terms of both national and global action. A few data about disasters and why this is significant, very, very significant for the OSCE mandate. This very powerful triple mandate that the organization has and for which parliamentarians are so critical for its implementation. Over the past 30 years in particular, the trend of disasters is that the economic losses are accelerating and escalating very quickly. There is much success in reducing the loss of life, particularly in some parts of the world. In others, regrettably, the loss of life keep going up. This is thanks to building early warning system, capability for warning people, organizing people, for evacuation and getting people out of harm's way. But you cannot get people's asset out of harm's way as easily. And therefore, with the growing global wealth, and wealth growing in most countries in the world, the figures are quite staggering. In OECD alone, which controls well over 50% of all the wealth in the world, the exposure to disaster losses every year has increased with well over 170%. And the data is not encouraging because in most parts of the world, the loss to disasters to the annual GDP is growing faster than the GDP is growing itself. Already 40 years, scientists were telling us in the United Nations and elsewhere that unless we watch carefully, the cost of disasters because of environmental growth, destruction, because of population growth, because of exposure in the most vulnerable areas of countries, disaster losses are going to have a significant impact on countries' economy, disruption, and therefore I would say also a significant contribution to undermining security and safety. What does it mean? Well, look around the world, you can see that the fastest economic growth is happening in the most exposed areas of countries. Coastlines exposed to hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoon. River basins. Many of the biggest global centers in the world are actually placed on some of the most dangerous seismic fault lines in the world. I just came back from Japan yesterday, and we talked about the 2011 earthquake and tsunami and the consequences of Fukushima. But the reality in Japan is that they are planning for, within the next 30 years, as they say, a major similar earthquake in Western Japan. And of course, everyone's fear of a well-defined earthquake in Tokyo. The advantage of that is Japan is a very rich country, has the technology, is working continuously on its infrastructure, on its building, and therefore the impact can be mitigated. Many countries in the world do not have the knowledge, capacity, or the financial resources to do that. So this is the conclusion on the economy is that for many countries, particularly today when the economic growth in many countries are not very large, that the cost of your disasters are much higher than the economic growth. And think about Europe, the enormous expansion of flooding in the several decades going. And only recently do we see major initiatives over flooding. We can talk long of why this has been lasting. It's got to do with property rights. It's got to see who is paying for disasters, who is paying for reconstruction. And it's got to do with countries' ability, willingness, and tradition to work together across borders. Because the defining issue around disasters today, and certainly for the future, is that they really test the transboundary cooperation. Disasters know no borders. Think about waterways. think about airwaves, think about how displaced people may live, the drying up of common water resources and water basins, all leading to potential disasters and certainly disrupting people's economic basis and countries' economic basis. So looking at it from an OSCE perspective, and this was the topic of a conversation at the ministerial meeting a few weeks ago in Prague. What is the link between disaster and security? Many people say, is there really a link? Should you really bring it together? And I don't think we need to bring it together in the work that I am doing, but in the consultation over the past 2.5 years, globally, regionally, and nationally, for a new 2015 disaster risk management framework. Countries say that conflict cause and also help sometimes disaster risk to be on the table. So nationally and locally, of course, the interlink between the interdependency between conflict, safety, and the disasters is very clear. Now, I would say that only recognizing this is helping to look at it also from an international perspective, because what we are doing together with countries is, of course, to look at their risk assessment capability, the capability of institutions to manage risk, access to data and information, and also having adequate risk governance frameworks and institutions nationally. I mentioned the floods here in Europe, and in the connection of demining, many of you are very familiar with the dramatic impact of the latest only flooding in the Balkans, which washed up lots of mines in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Croatia, and of course forced people and interventions that are not used to dealing with this aspect of disaster. So this link to all of us, I think, is critically important. Just to mention 2015, disaster risk reduction is, in fact, has always been in the UN work and in most countries' work, a development issue. Why not a humanitarian issue? Because the work is about strengthening institutions. It's to ensure that they have the capability, the instruments, and the resources. Many countries are heavily decentralized, others are very centralized. So depending on the national structures, the capability at local level where disasters hit to really manage them, respond to them, and anticipate them is a bit lagging behind, to put it very frankly. In 2015, in March 2015, there is the third UN, United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. It takes place in Japan. Later in the year, the United Nations memberships are coming together to determine a new development vision. And in 2015, December, the world is again coming together to decide on, I hope, a new climate agreement. Now, these three things are, of course, intimately linked. And the people who work with disaster risk reduction in your countries, their highest wish is that the new 2015 opportunity is a clear recognition, policy, and practice how closely linked climate change, disaster risk, and development is. You would think this is an obvious thing, but because the global processes are politically very distinct, it is not so obvious. So that is one of the main areas that we are really working on, and I think the importance of national parliaments, of regional parliaments, and your parliaments cannot be understated in understanding and supporting this area of work. The disaster risk, as I say, is accumulating faster to the future than ever before, precisely because of the way countries' options for development, where growth is, where physical assets are growing, and how much the population is aware of this. It is also growing because of the impact of climate variability and change. Drying, flooding, the most costly disaster today in the world, globally speaking, is urban flooding. And it floods wherever you would not have expected flooding before, just because the way our cities are constructed, old infrastructure, plumbing and drainage that cannot cope with water, and also because we are not looking into how do we prevent this enough. So in a way, I'm bringing a message of things that can be done. There is a lot of things that can be done. A few years ago, I think 5 years ago now, understanding that this requires an all-of-society approach. Not only governments are important, they need support by all of society. We, UNISDR, established a parliamentary network and a parliamentary advisory group to our work. And through the passion and hard work of these individuals, we've learned a lot about what parliamentarians and parliament can do. And I will share with you some of the recommendations based on this experience where parliaments have already proven around the world that they are critically important. One is the area of public awareness, advocacy, and education. Every parliamentarian is linked to a local constituency and can bring much practical experience to the discussion. In addition, everyone is a professional. They are scientists, lawyers, experts in many areas that can really bring very concrete areas both to the public in the regions and countries, but also to the global agenda. As legislators, of course, legislators create and look at legal frameworks, but let me start with one of the big opportunities. Most countries, in fact, already have legal frameworks that include risk management. The challenge is that they are all segregated from each other. How many countries do have, of course, environmental protection? And for 30 years, the recommendation has been, in the environmental impact assessment, include disaster risk. No need to necessarily create new legislation, but just make sure the existing one is there. So who is looking at this overarching legal frameworks that all would encompass risk? For example, on urban planning, land use planning, environmental protection, building standards, building codes, education, health system, safety of schools, hospitals, and functionality, meaning how do the workers in schools and hospitals also protection. So check for these opportunities when legislation is coming to the table to really look at how it interacts with other legislation and prevent, and this is something that we've learned, prevent what is called policy-induced risks. What is policy-induced risks? It's when regulations and legal frameworks end up have clashing interests, so to say. If we are not checking what we already have and what it says, they may actually contradict each other and create new risks. This is, I think, a high risk today in many countries that base their work on legal frameworks. Also issues that, in fact, relate to human rights. We have just over the past few weeks, I have been engaged in Human Rights Council discussions on the rights of indigenous people, on the rights of people living with disability, on women, and on human rights overall. So all these bodies, treaty bodies, have found that disaster risk is a major area that needs to consider all these rights. In most countries, this is already obvious. Countries have ratified the treaties. Now, how do we make them speak to each other? Information access and availability of risk information to citizens. This is a major area of positive evolution. It is not necessarily withheld because of perception that it's not good to let people know what risks are. But sometimes it's that the accessibility of the data is so complicated, so it's not useful. Examples of, for example, global climate data. We often say local governments should plan for the future, but local government very rarely have the capability to use the global data, and even when downscaled to national level, it's still complicated for a local government to use that as a basis for a 30-year planning for the infrastructure. Lots of work going on now in many countries to ensure that local government can use this risk data for flood management, for use in land use planning areas. Assist in establishing adequate and efficient risk governance frameworks. In many countries, and international institutions for that matter, it's been brought to our attention that one of the bottlenecks is the unclear responsibilities among different institutions. In fact, sometimes they end up competing. Accountability can be strong, but accountability can also lead to a bit of turf watching, I have been told by some national governments. So the risk governance framework is about responsibilities in institutions, the quality of institutions, but also helped through the legal basis to understand how accountability nationally, who is responsible for what and when. And the governance discussion is actually on top of the 2015 discussion for us. Maybe it will not be a very exciting global conference to discuss institutions, so that will not be the top agenda, but underpinning this is a great interest in most countries in the world today to learn from each other and find the efficient frameworks. For example, it is often said that decentralization is a good thing to do. What has been learned by many countries is when it comes to managing disaster risk, it may actually impose new challenges, because managing disaster risk requires investment that sometimes the central government can only do, and local government may have different political priorities than the central governments do. So finally, before you close, I'm sure you've never heard about the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. We're probably one of the smallest entities in the UN, so I just want to share with you perhaps why you never heard about it, but I hope you will hear more in the future. The reason why is we are in fact headquartered here in Geneva, but have regional representations around the world. But we can only implement what we do through the collaboration with national governments, local governments, parliaments, civil society group, international institutions and UN system, of course, regional parliaments, very activist in this area. So that's why you probably hear a little bit less about us and hopefully much more about the work that is being conducted. And my final point, which I think parliamentarians may be able to help with, in our collaboration with national governments, they very often run into the slight challenge that they aren't necessarily talking to each other. I'll give you a very precise and practical example. In our preparation for the World Conference next March, of course, we work with the national expert institutions and many ministries. Now, their relations with the foreign ministries are not very often very strong. But of course, it's the foreign ministries that represent countries when it comes to international negotiations. So this better mechanisms at national level for working together as one government is a very critical element that can be supported and engaged by parliamentarians, because many of your country's parliaments are already engaged in this work, and I hope you have encountered them. If not, I hope after this meeting that you will encounter them in your national parliaments, and that you will also realize how many regional parliaments around the world already have put this item very high on their agenda. Thank you.